Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode here on the channel. Happy 2024, everyone. I'm your host, Gable Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. My guest today is a postgraduate doing an MA course at Nottingham Trent University. She's also been freelancing as a collections intern and researcher at Bolton Museum and Art Gallery. And at her university, she has assumed various roles, including student mentor, RISE ambassador, and the development badminton team captain. Her main focus for historical research is the role of women in the medieval period, and her main focus for her dissertation are Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile. Joining us for the first time on the channel is Lucinda Lancaster. Lucinda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This is one of my first podcast that I've done, and I'm really happy it's you that's the one that's asked me.
You're welcome. So, tell us like a little brief bio about yourself, as well as your interest in women in the medieval period and why you chose those two powerful figures in history.
I've been a student at Nottingham Trent for both my undergraduate and my now postgraduate degree, and I'm now looking at doing a PhD with them as well, but that's all up in the air at the moment. It's only just been sent off today. I had my graduation for my undergraduate in December, and that I got a first class honours, which I'm quite proud of. And now at my postgraduate, like I said, I'm studying Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile. This started from when I was in primary school. We've always been taught history, and we've been looking at like Tudors and the Queen Victoria, so the Victorian period. And beyond that, you don't really learn much more queens. So a lot of these queens before like Elizabeth and Mary are forgotten. And even ones from the Plantagenets, that is probably one of the biggest periods of history, is more or less not even mentioned in the curriculum anymore.
Right.
So bringing these two women, it kind of shows that women were always present in history. There's always someone involved. There's like, name any event in history, there's a woman there behind all the men, which shouldn't be the case. They should be alongside them. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, she's probably one of the best known women. She's been wrote about since the 12th century, but there's always something missing. She's missing her agency and her power as herself in Aquitaine and with her husbands, because her husbands, they restricted her power by the end of their marriages, and she was very powerful as a woman, and this kind of threatened many people, especially the kings of the time. And she wasn't afraid to use that power. So looking at her as a queen is a very good point. But because she's so well known, there's some people know her already. There is more to say. But then when you bring her again alongside her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, who she actually did take off to be married to Louis VIII as one of her last acts as being in public politics.
Right.
So Blanche of Castile is really not known. She may be known in France and Spain a lot better than in England, but beyond, like, I think there's one translated biography on her, and that's about it in England at the moment. And so by bringing them two alongside each other, you get to see this generational influence of women, but as well, you get to see that Eleanor was not exactly unique in the sense of what people call unique now, but she had this specific training and methods that all women were taking, like patronage that they used. And I said they're influenced by their sons and their husbands. But the sons was particularly important because both had to take control during their rules, and most of their power came through what they forced or manipulated their sons to do.
Right.
Such as in Eleanor of Aquitaine's case, there's this really big thing where she stopped the marriage between Richard and Alice of France, which is Louis VII's daughter. She stopped this marriage because she found Berengaria of Navarre to be a lot better suited for her needs, not necessarily her sons, because she had more powerful. Navaria was nearer to Aquitaine, and this could consolidate her dowager lands.
Wow, dang, she was pretty intense and pretty powerful. So, when you began creating your dissertation for these two powerful figures in history, what sort of need or desire did you want to satisfy for people who will be reading this and examining this? Like, how did you want to approach these two women in history as opposed to how they've been presented already?
Well, they've already been presented as like mainly through maternal bonds. It's like most of the stories about them, even when historians write, they will say Blanche of Castile took over the regency for her son. Everything's on behalf of their sons, for this person. There's not really, it kind of negates their agency and power that they already had. Both of these women, they were born into nobility, and they had like this power before they were married. Marriages consolidated this power and made it bigger, but they were not strangers to their own power, and this is seen in a lot of things, like their seals. Blanche of Castile has her seal that she puts on letters, and it says Queen of France, but on the counter seal, which is on the back of it, it says that she's from the land of Castile. So this is her showing off that she's got this natal family, she's powerful in her own right. But this is all mostly forgotten. She's just Queen of France. That's more or less most books on her will be called Blanche of Castile, Queen of France. And then there's this book in Ellen of Aquitaine's case by Ralph Turner, who her entire title for the book is Ellen of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England. So it's not taking on board anything that's hers. So if you look at so by looking at Regency periods, yes, it is in France and England, but it's by themselves. It's their sons are out, they're doing stuff on behalf of their sons, but it's written by themselves. It's the easiest way to see what they were doing themselves, because most things were written in their name and they were doing it by themselves with a couple of like magnates and prelates as well.
Fascinating. So it seems like you're giving or returning their voices back to the modern world to show who these women were, and that, you know, the stories that have been written about us, it's only like a fraction of, you know, who we were or what they were. And ultimately, what would you say your promise you're making to yourself and also to people who may read this? And what do you want them to experience and feel when learning about these women? Do you want them to like get a different perspective on them or broaden their perspective on these two powerful women?
Well, it's bringing the queens visible. Mostly their things have been left in domestic spheres, and it's not just queens. I am focusing on queens because it's for the purpose of sources, it's the easiest thing to find. But there's so many studies on normal women, ordinary women that are missing. There's so many stories about this that they're not actually hard to find. Like I said, in the Bayeux Tapestry, there are so many characters, and I think there's around 4, maybe 3 women involved. So they were always there, but hidden. They were never the main characters, when in fact there's a lot of cases where women should be brought to the front, because it will give you a fuller perspective of history. And half the population's female, why are we ignoring them? So I'm trying to, like, first and foremost, it's to an academic audience, but in the future, I would really want to bring this idea into schools. Like my supervisor, she has this thing where she will go into schools, teach them, and show them women that we may not have ever heard of.
Ooh.
And there's new exhibits being put in the British Library and British Museum. I think it's coming in this year on women in history. And it just seems, although it's a good aim, we've been globalizing our history. We seem to still be globalizing it on a male scale. We're looking at male expressions of power. We're looking at decolonization from the male perspective. We are not looking at how this impacted women. There's still this very patriarchal lens of history. And I'm hoping that by doing this, we'll show that women aren't secondary. They're not weaker. We're here. And it kind of shows that women, yeah, we started appearing in history from the 1960s, 70s. That's when with the rise of feminism, this is when history was being viewed through a feminist lens. But the feminist lens isn't necessarily the best thing to view. We need to look at gender studies. We need to look at men alongside women. We need to not elevate women. We need to show them that males also were limited. It wasn't just women are all powerful, which is how sometimes Eleanor gets perceived. She gets seen as, I think one of the chroniclers, I think it's Richard of Device, says she is incomparable. She is the only thing that but this lack of comparability is meaning that we are just ignoring every other woman. And my main thing, if I was to get this into public history, is so that little girls and anyone, regardless of race, gender, sex, that you can be seen as in history. You are not alone. There is so many repetitions of history. And I want someone that's sat in a classroom to not be thinking that this is a boring subject, that why we learn about it, it's not me. There is you in every generation.
Powerful. I 100% agree. And that kind of leads into a perfectly good question to this is, when you decide in school, in your university, that this dissertation was something that you wanted to discuss and research, what was the initial feedback like from like counselors and teachers? Did they provide avenues, or did they say, I don't think you should do this, there's not a lot of historical research, or maybe not a lot of historical research, but like what kind of story or argument can you make? Did you have that experience or no?
Well, my supervisor, Natasha Hodgson, she's very well known for medieval and gender studies. So she at first was not hesitant, but she was like, oh, this could be difficult. But when you bring in a comparative element, you open up the sources a little bit wider, you've opened up your analysis a lot wider.
All right.
And although there's like a lot of sources that mention them, there's so many chronicles, I think it's about 10 chronicles that mention Ella of Aquitaine. These are like very minute introductions. So then you've got to draw from household charters, letters, because there's like this whole database of letters that she wrote. And then you look at patronage and seals, and like there's this commemorative painting work that's been done mostly in the 18th century, where you look at pictures of Eleanor. So this is when you can draw in a lot of different histories, and it becomes almost overwhelming how much sources there are. But if you narrowed it, so we decided to narrow it down to the Crusade Regency periods rather than just queens. So it's basically about getting this main overarching idea and then cutting it down to as far as you can. With the Crusade Regency periods, we can also bring in ideas of like gender, and you can look at how, because there's a lot of times where it's not just the queen that's ruling. Obviously, she's ruling with magnates and prelates, and we're bringing in this parliament thing. And there's this with Crusade Regencies, there's this whole Crusades are very well documented. So there's so many charters that you can see, and there's even like communications from Crusades. So Louis sending messages back to Blanche to implement certain things, or for Eleanor, there's this one where she's being influenced. She's asking, her son is asking her to kind of influence the election of the Archbishop. So there is this source space, and me and Natasha, we've been working at it, and like I said, we've been looking at doing the PhD now, and it's a fascinating topic. She says that looking at the network of sisters and networks of generations is a very interesting topic, and it said it's very under-researched, and if it has been done, it's not been done to a full effect. There's stuff that's still missing, as there always will be with most studies, but this one, there's still this newness to it.
Awesome. And I love that you brought that up, because it is kind of like an underrepresented focus of history, because there's a lot of histories that are underrepresented. And for me, being like a classical historian and classical antiquities background, there's a lot of even powerful women in the classical age that kind of get overlooked. Zenobia and Persia and Levant region, some of the powerful women of Rome often get overlooked. It's really sad that we really don't show the full history, because we kind of limit ourselves to like different perspectives, because all these players existed in the same time in their respective histories, but we're only looking at, as you said, only one perspective, as like, you know, the men in the history, like the kings, the knights, the major powers. It is kind of sad. And sort of like a tangent question before we go into the next one. Before solidifying the sphere, which was the crusading period, did you have any other powerful women from the early to middle medieval period that you thought they would be really good to explore, but probably there was too much information, or maybe not enough information to cover in your overall topic?
Yeah, there's quite a few that we were looking at. So there's Melisande of Jerusalem and her sisters, Hodiana, Alice, and Yvette. Yvette's really interesting because she's the only one of the sisters that didn't go on to marry. She ended up being she formed an abbey instead, and these sisters funded and helped her along with this, but then also in return she helped. And this would be good for the crusade, but it's a different kind of policies and politics than back in Western Christendom, because obviously this was a very new state being formed. And it's also engages a bit too much with interdisciplinary, like inter-politics and this connection with each other. So that in itself could be a dissertation. And what I wanted to focus on was drawing out these connections with generations and looking at Eleanor. I really wanted to look at Eleanor. That's what kind of forced this. I was trying to find someone that could be compared to Eleanor, and unfortunately Melisande didn't actually do that. But this is future research. It could be used. And then there's a really interesting one with Matilda of Tuscany and Margaret, I think it's her mother. That's a really interesting study because there's not very much known about her mother, but what we do know is that Matilda was very heavily influenced by her mother and basically continued the regency and rules as her mother did. There is very much the sameness across the board. And so that's interesting, but it's in Italy, it's very limited research, and the facilities aren't as well preserved as other countries. So that's a lot harder to find much studies on, although it has been done. But for looking at a 15,000 word dissertation that needs to be completed within 8 months is not really the period. There's not really enough time to do that, so it's not feasible to do it for a dissertation.
Ah, okay.
And then there's even more, if you wanted to make it England centric, which I didn't, I wanted to make it more not entirely global but across Christendom. There's the study of Empress Matilda, who was before Anne of Aquitaine.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. For me, whenever I think of powerful women of history, Lucinda, are you there? I think we slight little difficulties, but okay, we're all good. Oh no, I was just gonna say, for me, when I think of medieval or early medieval women, probably before the crusading period, one I think I just found, which is fascinating, which is the aunt of William the Conqueror, who was also the wife to what was his name? He was a Danish king, probably one of the last few Viking kings of the 1060s or 1050s, and her agency was really, really interesting, especially being the descendant of Rollo, who founded Normandy. And when I found out that she was the aunt of William the Conqueror, I was like, okay, that is already pretty fascinating. But yeah, like you said, there's a lot of very interesting women in history, a lot of powerful medieval women, but then trying to find the connection between the two is really, really difficult, which kind of leads into the next question is, when you sort of gather your research and got the comparison for Eleanor and Blanche, did you feel that your research and your dissertation was validated in the sense that, yes, I can actually make something from this?
Yeah, there's a lot of connections that can be formed, and it is really satisfying when you find them. And so we're looking at letters, and that was quite interesting because obviously letter writing has been a thing that has always been established, and there's this pattern that they follow. There's like 5 rules that they follow, and that's very interesting. But you can see the way that they talk, there is very similarities in how they present their power, how they show it. And then there's the bits looking at how they actually were involved in politics through sons, and they reached periods which had very similar effects. But obviously the main difference is the events that happen, which is obviously beyond the control of a comparison.
Right.
But so you can look at how they react to an event. So in 1193, when Richard was taken captive on his return from the crusade, Eleanor did letter writing and formed this ransom, and she was very active in doing this. Even despite the Pope almost leaving her on her own, he kind of excommunicated, I think he excommunicated Henry, not Luke. But this didn't really do much other than the fact that because he didn't do anything to get her son back to her. This was mostly on her. And there's 3 very powerful letters that are documented from her. Obviously, there's debate on if it's her that sent them, but most historians agree that she had some involvement. There's this one very powerful line that says, "If you're give me back my son, if you're a man of God." Talking to so she's attacking the Pope in the sense of he's not Christian enough if she's not helping, which is mind-blowing that you could think that someone could do that.
Yeah, that's pretty gutsy for her to do that. I mean, she pretty much called out his manhood in essence at that time, to use a more modern term. But dang, that is pretty powerful of Eleanor to do. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of stuff you've found in your research, more of her, to use a modern term, badassery of her and Blanche. What kind of leads into another question, which is, when gathering, this research for both Eleanor and Blanche, I would imagine it is very, time consuming to try to construct a narrative for your dissertation. And you probably have moments of burnout. So in those moments of burnout where you're just I don't want to work, I don't want to do this anymore, but you have to do this. What is your why? Why do you study history, and what motivates you to continue pursuing this aspect of history?
That's a full-on question.
Yeah, it's one of my heavy hitters.
But yeah, it's just, you've got to think about the end product. You have to take a step back, look at what you've got, look at where you started, and you've got to think, why am I doing this? And mostly for me, it's always, I want to understand history. Without knowing what these women did, you wouldn't understand history. And it's what do you want to give back? When you're doing anything, you've got to think, what are you giving back? What is the lesson that you can learn from this?
Right.
And with me, this lesson is women are visible, women are loud, women are proud. And this idea of I wouldn't go as far as feminist, but I would go and say that we need to see women. Without seeing women, there's so many problems that can encounter. And I just think that I want to know that in one day in time that this little girl is sat in class and is learning about a female figure. And I had something to do with that because I brought out some form of this feminist narrative, this female narrative and agency.
Powerful. Really, really powerful. And kind of going on in that, tying to that, for you, Lucinda, who is your role model for history growing up? And ultimately, who do you want to teach for? Who is your imaginary audience that you want to tell your stories to?
Well, influences at really early age. My family have always been crazy about history. My granddad has books and books on it. And I used to go over there quite often, and you just hear him talk, and you'd be like, wow, I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to sit here and just talk. And so my family are really strong in history. But then I started reading my own books, started getting my own voice, and I started moving into female history and gender studies. And Philippa Gregory, the historical fiction writer, I love her so much. I went to see her only a couple of months ago at one of these meetings. She's got a new book out, which is based with, in part, what I want to do. It's called Normal Women, and it's her from medieval period doomsday book to present day, looking at the normal women.
All right.
And that's where I started learning about all these women. I was like, oh wow, there are hundreds, thousands of women that are still documented that we don't look at these documents. And then there's medieval period that comes from the Ian Mortimer. He wrote a book, Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, and that was so interesting. He wrote it like it was like a travel guide book, and he was like, oh, and look onto your left and you can see this. And that was so interesting for my little brain. I was ecstatic. It was like, oh wow, history is another world. It's like the cliche,
right?
And that's what got me started. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to be able to write like that and emulate this idea and bring in women forward. And regards to who I write for, I write to my little cousins. I look at them, they're 11 and 13 now, and I sit there and I'm like, these girls, they're just starting their history. They're just starting learning their history and remembering it. I want these little girls growing up now to know history. I want them to understand, because it's a lot easier to impact a young child's mind and to look at different perspectives than it is for, say, an older academic. Although if I could influence them and explain to them that maybe involving women in some more meaningful way rather than as a side note character is very powerful, and it just changes the narrative a little bit. I always find, even if it doesn't, it just complements the fact that there are women. You cannot have a nation without a woman being there. And yeah,
I 100% agree. History is an ever-changing field. It's always being updated, and especially now more than ever, it's important to tell stories that are being forgotten. And as historians, it's our job to keep these stories alive, because if we don't tell them, who will? Yeah,
it's definitely giving voice to the forgotten voices, and that started for me in a completely different setting. I went to Auschwitz with the school. It was like, and that when I was about 17, and I went, and I asked if me and a couple of others could do a presentation. And the idea was humanization, this idea of this wasn't a fantasy, good versus evil battle. This was humans on human violence. And I was doing this, I did talks to children from the ages of 14 when it gets entered into curriculum to 18, and people were like, you show them a picture of like the Nazis and they look like ordinary people, and you tell them to tell you who you think it is before you tell them, and they cannot tell the difference. They have no clue. So this idea of giving the alternative narrative, giving something else, really sharpens history.
I 100% agree. I remember a friend of mine who almost did something similar to what you just said. They actually did a dissertation on a famous book which talks about, the transformation when looking at, the ordinary people during World War II and how they turned into some of the most vile men of the Nazi regime. And you couldn't even tell the difference. I mean, these are ordinary people, but the transformation is just so, it really upsets you. And ultimately, history, among many things, is supposed to upset you. It's supposed to make you angry sometimes. And it's supposed to make you feel something. In the end, the history is supposed to make you feel something. It's supposed to make you wonder, why wasn't I taught this before? And kind of that as a tangent, has someone that you know, either like a family member or a former student, come up to you and say, wow, thank you for telling me about this. I had no idea that this happened or this person existed. Why wasn't I told this? Have you ever had that little experience at university?
It's when I've been working at my museum, I've been finding it's more localized history, it's the local museum. And within this, I've been down in the archives finding sources that are covered in dust that haven't been touched in years. And these people are like these curators, and I'm finding all the stuff that curators didn't even know about because they've been catalogued before they were even started. And there's all these stories about people in Bolton, that lives, just regular lives of people. And because obviously I'm probably two generations away from the war, maybe three, I think, actually.
Right.
I don't really know much about that. And a lot of people are getting further and further away from First and Second World War. But I found that I've got like this little book my granny used to keep, and it's talks about how she was near one of the bomb sites and people had forgotten about this, and it's only recently that this has been discussed, and we're trying to get audio copies of people that were potentially still living or had parents that were living. We're trying to really get audio history back and like oral testimonies before, well, everyone's gone, because obviously time is of the essence within regard to most of these things. We're really getting less and less history from the people that lived it.
Right.
And so when you're telling people about, oh yes, this person, my nana did this, people are really shocked to find that you're so close to history events as well. They don't realise it. If you've been told, oh, well, the war ended in 1945, that seems so alien to so many people. It's
right.
before so many people were born that it's almost forgotten. And that's only about, 80, 70 years ago. So if we go back further, people are forgetting so much. Like, even with Blanche of Castile and Elf Aquitaine, most people don't know they know their names, they just don't know them. So I was talking about Blanche of Castile's involvement in the Shepherd's Crusade in 1251, and how, well, I'm not too sure. We've not looked into it as much detail just yet. I've just found one or two sources that counter-oppose each other. And it says that she was responsible for it. These shepherds said, we want to join the crusade. And so she said, you've got my blessing, come to Paris and we'll send you on your way. But this was at a point where she was desperate. She hadn't had contact from her son, and if she did, it was like, the crusade's turning back. It's turning bad for us. We're not going well. So there's this chronicler, I think it's Matthew Paris. He presents her as doing it all for her son, not thinking of the consequences. And throughout their entire march in France to Paris, there was chaos, riots, and all sorts going on. And Blanche apparently did nothing because she said, they are crusaders, they have my blessing. And it was only until they hit Paris and she realised they were not going on crusade that she revoked it and quelled the violence. And people are shocked to find that she was so involved with it, and this split turn. And people are just, when I talk about it, people don't realise the emotion behind what Blanche was experiencing. Her son, right, her firstborn son, going off to the crusade and lost him. Well, not lost him, but feels like she's going to lose him, is clasping at anything to get people involved. But she's also so statesmanlike in the end, although there is this debate, was she too little too late? But she manages to stop it, and there's very limited fallout from this. The peasants just disperse, and it continues. So overall, yes, it was a mistake on her behalf, but how much can we actually say that this was a problem for her crusade period? Has this happened before? Because then people are like, oh, well, she's a hysterical woman, she can't have control. But this has happened repeatedly with men as well, but we just say we use different words to describe men, and it still happens today. like hysterical, women's hysteria, and men are just like they've just got a little bit frantic. There's not the same negative.
The wording is very different, and it has different weight to whoever has the word before their name. Yeah.
But yeah, so there's lots of instances when this has been discussed, and people are like, "Oh, I didn't know that." Even though people are like, "Why are you doing medieval history? It's done to death. There's so many studies on it. There's," and then you tell them a fact, and they're like, "I didn't know that." I'm like, "Well, that's the medieval period," and so you're telling me that it's overdone, this study, when it's really not. Nothing's ever overdone. There's always someone new coming along that can go, well, this is a different impact. This has got a different thing. There's people that will counteract me. There's people that will even come up with a new idea that no one's ever thought of.
Definitely. And as we said before, like that's the thing about history. History is always changing. History is always evolving. And that's what's important for history. It has to be constantly changing, has to be evolving, because we need new information to either update or sometimes revoke or counter old things that have been believed to be true. And sometimes it's necessary. And then that also comes from a lot of different research, a lot of different books that we all have to read, even if it's the ones that we are not particularly fond of reading, which then kind of leads into two questions. What types of books have you read that have helped you with your historical research on your dissertation? And kind of going back to like a previous question, who are your biggest inspiration when it comes to learning history? Are there any particular historians that you've researched and admired in the way of how they present history, how they write history, and stuff like that?
Well, I normally, when I'm doing research, I start off with looking at understanding the woman, the person I'm looking at, be that Eleanor Aquitaine, Blanche of Castile, or even in my smaller studies that I have to do, like little essays and little modules on, I don't know, we do some on the American War, American Revolution, and like you look at, what you start off with is you look at the broad history. They're normally called survey texts. So
Right.
you'll study, and this will normally just be the big, bold, very thick books. And then I go through the bibliography and find more direct case studies. And this is what I did for Eleanor of Aquitaine. You just search in Eleanor of Aquitaine, and then you come up with so many biographies on her that is just her life. It's narrative studies, which is not exactly the best, but there's a starting point. So you've got Alison Weir and Ralph Turner that do biographies of her. They're the two main ones that I've been using. And then from there, you go on to looking at, you do theory studies. So you look at what theories there are. So what theories can tie in with Eleanor is such as like queenship, gender studies, power,
Right.
medieval. So then, but currently right now I'm just at that stage, and there's this very interesting book, the article that Ralph Turner does as well, which is Eleanor of Aquitaine as presented through the 12th century chroniclers. So he talks about the chroniclers, their agendas, their influences, and why she's written in such a way. So he goes in to explain why she's been demonized in some and why she's valorized in others. So this helps you get an understanding of like what was being the idea of her at the time. Was it because they were monastic chroniclers? Was it because they knew her? And was it because they were writing a history for her?
Right.
So this is what all influences her. And a similar thing happens with Blanche. Although much less in England, there's not very many English translations of her of books about her. You've got one, I think was in the 1970s by Regine Pinaud, which was translated. But that one, I say, belongs to old historiography. It's very much tells you what she does, but doesn't really go into much. It just says she did it for her son, or her sons did this for her. It is very much male-orientated focus, and calls her a domineering mother, and that's what. But like very recently, I think it's 2016, Lindy Grant wrote this book, And the first half, it's a very thick book. And the first half of it is the narrative of her life. And then the second half, she dedicates to this analysis of her. So that's really interesting. So there is this many sections that she breaks it down into periods of her life. So she looks at her as like in Castile, then it looks at her with her husband in court, then it looks at her with her husband as queen consort, then looks at her as the queen regent for the minority, then as queen dowager, and on and on. And then so this analyzes, so that just tells you the story of Blanche. And then the second half of the book, she breaks it down into the kinds of power she had. The power and authority is what she calls it. So looking at kind of how she used the church, how she used her family connections, and how she used her own power that she created. So that one's definitely the basis book, and it's very good, and she uses all sorts of sources, and that's how I ended up looking at all these different sources, like letters and chronicles and charters.
Nice.
So yeah, and I'm still looking at other stuff, but like the theory books are very hard hitting, very dry, but they're interesting because it shows how little, even comparative studies looking at queens, they don't really involve queens much. They say, this is the theory, here's a queen that complies to it, let's move on. There's very limited comparisons in anything.
Right.
It's very single focused on one. And so Linda Grant has got to be one of the strongest people that I found so far in this writing. She writes very focused, and she brings in so much. It can be overwhelming when you read it because it's just fact after fact after fact, but it's really interesting. And it shows how she developed, how, considering Blanche of Castile has very limited texts on her, how even using a handful of them can bring out such a rich history and narrative of women.
Dang, that is impressive. And it looks like we're nearing almost the end of our interview. So we have the last two questions. So the second to last question, Lucinda, that I'm going to ask you is, throughout your academic journey up to this point in your life, who have been your biggest supporters? And probably the most important question, which I think you may have already said before, maybe you can say it again, is what is your word of wisdom to people who are interested in studying history and or those who are already in their field of history but are experiencing some burnout in their field?
So, biggest supporters first. I'd have to say, obviously, parents, but in the more academic side, I'd have to say my lecturers. One specific lecturer who got me on this trajectory, and I've not looked back since, Sergio Luzana. He told me that I write really well, that my essays are really strong, and that I could do this. This is something that I could do, and not to sell myself short. And that got me on this trajectory of thinking about MA and then PhD. Because like I said, as an idea that still is a potential, I was going to go into secondary school teaching, but being told by someone in the profession that I am quite good at what I do, it really set me off on this. I can do it. And that's what most people need. That you need this validation. And
right.
It's not, like I said, it's not the only reason why I did it, but just being told that you can do something, this voice in your head just disappears and you're like, yes, I can. And then this is when the ideas started spinning that I can do all this stuff, that I shouldn't be constrained and confined to what my original plan was. So this started off, and then I started talking to Natasha, and this started developing into, this could be a PhD, this idea is really good. And so that's where I started. I said, advice, it's just know that you're good enough, that your idea, there's always something. Like, it took me a couple of years to get my niche. I started off wanting to do memory studies. I really like the idea of looking at memory of the Holocaust and this, but some part of me, when I did a module on the Crusades, changed my mind. I was like, whoa, the medieval period isn't as dark and depressing as what it seems when, like, because that's what the popular view is. It's the medieval period. It's all. So there's this very thing of like, you've got to realize that your niche isn't going to come to you. You've got to look for it. But at the same time, you don't need to like force it to come. It will come in its own time. There'll just be a penny drops moment where you're like, I want to continue doing this. I don't want to stop researching. And it will take time. Like I said, I've known people that take a couple of years out between doing degrees because they're just so overwhelmed and they've got not really much plan. But once you embrace everything, and like I said, you don't have to take it as far as I do. You can do it as a hobby. There's always things that you can do as a part-time. And there's just options all the time, everywhere, if you look for them.
100%. I 100% agree with everything you said, Lucinda. And with that, listeners, we will conclude today's amazing interview. I want to thank our guest, Lucinda, for joining us today. Thank you, Lucinda, so much for joining us and showing the audience who you are. Before we officially end today's meeting, can you tell the audience where they can find and engage with you, and if they should look for any upcoming projects or papers that may be coming out soon?
I'm mostly just on LinkedIn at the moment. I'm still debating on starting YouTube channels. I just need to get advice from my lecturers about this and how to go about doing that. But that's still not actually a concrete plan yet. But yeah, I'm looking at trying to somehow make a conference with my dissertation once it gets a bit more along in its process. And there's going to be, and like I said, with the PhD, there's going to be more ideas with this. And I'm collaborating with Bolton Museum, looking at the impact of the air raids that I was mentioning before in Bolton. And obviously that's very niche, but there is a website that will be discussing this, and I'll try and bring out like ordinary stories, and this is where I'm bringing out and trying to look for interviews with people.
Nice. Well, if you ever want to look for someone, oops, so sorry, lost connection for a second. As I was saying, History with Jackson. He's another great historian and podcaster. So you may want to reach out to him, Lucinda. He's also on LinkedIn.
Okay.
All right, listeners. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the first episode here on the channel for 2024. Again, I want to thank my guest, Lucinda Lancaster, for joining us and for sharing with us her dissertation and what she is studying. Lucinda, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. Connection issues. So sorry about that, listeners. Well, I will see you again on the channel in the upcoming episodes. Make sure to check out the first episode of the out tomorrow, as well as the first author interview later this month. This has been The Wandering, signing out.